This is our November learning series, and we thought we'd just put together a recap of the things that we just did at NSTA last week. Um, and so you could have just a little taste of what we shared. And then if you want to know more, you can always contact us and we can help you out. All right. So with me today are my colleagues Tony and Lindsay, who are part of the MyStar curriculum team, and you may have seen them before. Lindsay always does learning series with us, and you may have met Tony before at NSTA or at he presents at our learning series sometimes, like he did in September. So they are two of the members of our curriculum team who work with us to write the units and update the units and all kinds of good stuff like that. So the three of us went to NSTA, the NSTA National Conference in Minneapolis last week, along with Marianne, who is our program director. And we did 4 sessions. And so Tony did one on analyzing graphs, which was highlighting the new off-the-shelf lesson on analyzing graphs that came out last spring, that I personally think is a really, really good lesson, like really tight, really cool. And then I did one on literacy, and we talked about some of the opportunities we have to help students with reading strategies in MyStar. I did one on CERs and highlighted our CER off-the-shelf lesson. And then Lindsay did one on using decision matrices. And we kind of broadened the appeal by talking about how it can be used in any project-based or place-based curriculum. But specifically, we talked about how we use it in MyStar, and there is also a standalone decision matrices lesson, off-the-shelf lesson, as well as some embedded lessons in some of our units. So we're going to give you kind of a brief overview of each of those things and maybe remind you or point out some resources that you didn't know existed, and or give you some ideas and remind you of some things that you might want to try out in your classroom. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Tony, who's going to give you the flyby highlights on the analyzing graphs off-the-shelf lesson.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Like Chris mentioned, I think we're all pretty excited about this new lesson. It takes a lot of things that we learned from reading apprenticeship and applies them to graphs and making sense of graphs. And yeah, we think it's a pretty solid lesson. So maybe to start with, just, those of you who are in these slides, if you could just kind of jot down some of the struggles that you've noticed with your students and their graph reading abilities. What kind of things are they having a tough time with? And just go ahead and add it on to the sticky slide, and we can add more notes if we need to. All right, it seems like typing's slowing down a little bit. Just in the interest of time, I'll probably start moving us along. But it seems like some of these struggles that are coming out are some of the ones that we really tried to address with this lesson. So things like students rushing through without even knowing what the topic is, kind of not connecting the graph back to the bigger question. Students having challenges analyzing data, difficulty finding patterns. Some of that is, I would say, is in this lesson as well. Students look at the surface level. I think maybe one of the struggles that we often see, and maybe you've noticed in your students as well, is sometimes when they see a new or especially an unusual graph, students tend to shut down and not want to engage with it. They just kind of freeze, like some deer in the headlights. And that was really one of our big goals with this lesson. Chris, maybe if we want to look at the goals, we really wanted to build student confidence when approaching new and especially challenging graphs. And the way we accomplish this is by helping them develop their own scaffold that they can use to make sense of graphs, and really to help you by training students in how to make their thinking visible so that, student thoughts are out on the page where you can start to see them and help them in usable ways. And then as a kind of a practical matter for teachers as well, we wanted to make this lesson really, really flexible with lots of opportunities for both student voice and choice and teacher voice and choice. So we just really provided a lot of resources that you can kind of pick and choose from to tailor to your classroom. And sort of one of the examples of this is the lesson really kicks off in the Uncover, where students are trying to answer the question, who's the better marathoner, horses versus humans? And they use the results from this race that's over in, I think it's in Wales, that's been running for like 40 years, where humans and horses have been running these marathon-like races to see who wins. And it's all the same data, but it's presented 4 different ways. We made 4 different graphs, and you can really pick and choose from these graphs to pick the ones that work best for you in your classroom. You could assign different groups, different graphs. You can model on one of the graphs and then assign students another one. There's really a lot of ways that you could get this done. But this Uncover is all about trying to discover how you personally make sense of graphs. And we do that through annotations. So along with the graphs, there's a set of annotation strategies that are sort of inspired by reading apprenticeship, just trying to help students make some connections to the graph and process how they're making sense of the data on the graph. And so, if your students are already familiar with these annotation strategies, they might be able to jump in, or this can be a really good kind of whole class activity to go through these annotation strategies as a class for the first time, sort of that gradual release of responsibility. And so what I think is really neat is that these annotations transition into, well, how did I make sense of that graph? What process did I go through? And students start making what we call this graph interpretation tool. And that's what they're really sharing out in the Share Your Ideas. And, we're personally pretty agnostic about the format or the tool that you want to use. And as teachers, you can guide students toward a process or a tool that has worked with you in the past. If you have a graph interpretation tool or scaffold that you've used that you really like, you can sort of shepherd students towards that. There's multiple exemplars provided in the lesson plan. My personal opinion is we want these tools to really be as concrete as possible with language that makes sense to students. Includes action verbs that encourage sense making. So a lot of times students will just want to say, check the x-axis, check the y-axis, and really pushing them to, describe that x-axis, describe that y-axis. What does that mean to me? Another big one that we saw mentioned in the challenges on the other slides is, trying to connect that graph back to the question or phenomenon. So, right, how does the title compare to the question? Well, how will this graph help me answer my question? And then, if you can, if you're there and your students are there, if it can be personalized, I think that's great. A lot of people like to start with the title. I personally am the title is the last thing I look at, because I use it to check to make sure if the author and I agree on what the graph is about. But those sorts of personalizations are something that you could do with this lesson plan. The last thing that I'm going to mention here is that for each graph, we also include a video of an expert going through the same process that the students did, so students can compare their process to experts. Then in the Connect, that's all about testing and refining that process that they made. So can you use your scaffold? And we provide 3 different graphs that are all unusual in their own ways, whether it's unusual conventions or asking students to interpolate between data points, or a format that's somewhat unusual in middle school. These are challenging graphs that students need to work with, and they can see how well their interpretation tools help them make sense of these graphs. And then finally, we get to the check, which is an admittedly insane task. It's uses the growth charts that you might see in a pediatrician's office. And it's very challenging. It's a tough graph. And what we really just want to see is, are students going to be able to use those tools to engage with this graph, or are they just going to, kind of shut down? And we got really excited in piloting because we saw some test result, or some of the feedback that we got from students on the next slide. This was from I believe it was a student with an IEP, and their answers here are technically wrong, right? They didn't figure everything out. They need some more numeracy skills to get the answer, quote unquote, right. But what I love to see is this student wasn't shutting down. They're asking all kinds of really great questions, and their thinking is really visible. I can see where, oh, they don't quite know what the slope of this graph means yet. They're even asking questions about it. Like, it was really, really exciting. So, if you want to try this graph out, it's on our website. It's publicly available, but, for subscribers, it's there too. And if you want to see a little bit more in depth about how the lesson runs, we do have a recording of the learning series that we did back in the spring that you can check out as well. So yeah, thanks everyone.
All right, thanks, Tony. We'll do some Q&A stuff at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the next presentation that we did, and that had to do with literacy instruction in MyStar units. So when we present at NSTA, we always present in a kind of curriculum generic way, but we try to show people what we've done in MyStar and kind of show them some ways they could maybe apply that in whatever curriculum they're using. And then, we always hope that they'll ask more about MyStar. But so we have some really nice literacy products in MyStar, and it's really been based on teacher feedback that has encouraged us to develop them. And so we wanted to present some of those things that we do. And so we started out with thinking about this whole idea of teaching reading in science. And I remember, in my undergrad and graduate reading in the content area classes, being kind of annoyed, like, I'm got to teach science. How am I going to stop and teach reading strategies? Because in my mind, the reading strategies were things like decoding and phonics and stuff like that, right? I'm like, I can't do that. I'm not a reading specialist, and it's not really my job. And if I do that, I can't really get to the science. And so for a long time in my career, I kind of ignored the whole reading piece. And it largely was based on this learning pyramid, which was a really big thing in my constructivist kind of science methods classes. You don't learn a lot, or you don't retain a lot from what you read and hear in a lecture. You learn and retain what you teach others and what you actually do and what you hear in discussions and stuff. And so for 20 years, I focused my instruction on that hands-on collaborative kind of stuff. And reading was kind of an afterthought. But then, the MyStar teaching community kept saying, yes, but our kids need to learn to read science text, and we don't have a textbook anymore. What can you do for us? So we had some grant money, and we started working with reading apprenticeship specialists out of West Ed. And you may or may not know that two of our units, 7.1 and 8.1, are fully embedded with reading apprenticeship strategies. And so as we were working with Heather Howlett from Reading Apprenticeship, we learned a lot from her about how to embed those reading strategies. One of the reading strategies is annotating visual text, like Tony was talking about in his lesson, where the kids start out by annotating a graph. And so in Reading Apprenticeship, we were assured that reading text includes things like pictures, charts, graphs, articles, of course, but diagrams, models, student-generated drawings. And I was like, okay, this sounds like stuff that our kids probably need to do in science, right? And that annotation is one way of helping kids make their thinking visible. Like, how do I attack this? How do I approach this as a literate, you know, mastery level reader? What are the things that are going through my mind? And so we embedded a bunch of those with Heather's help and with some of our MyStar teachers' help in 7.1 and 8.1. And then we were not going to be able to do that for all of our units. Plus, it also makes the units a little longer. So there's that. But what we did do then is go through all of our units in all of our middle lessons, and we added our differentiated readings. And we used a lot of that same philosophy of helping students interact with text, helping them to develop this kind of mental conversation about what's going on in the text, and inviting them to become good readers that way. And so if we think about, reading apprenticeship refers to those as metacognitive skills. And so if you think about the traditional reading guide that I did for 20 years when I needed a sub-plan or homework or whatever, I'd find a cool article in the Detroit News or something about something local that was related to what we were doing in class. And I would read the article and make sense of the text. And then I would write down what I thought were the key points in the form of questions that my kids had to find, and they were right or wrong. You find it or you don't, kind of closed-ended. And what the kids ended up doing was making my thinking visible. And I was hoping, okay, now that I've walked them through this, hopefully they understand this. But a metacognitive guide kind of flips that. And we ask the students to start out by making sense of the text. We give them some guiding questions to help them identify the points that are key, that stand out to them as sense makers. We use open-ended questions. And so very often student answers will vary. And students make their own thinking visible. And then the key for these always is no different than we do the uncover share cycle in our lessons, is you let kids try to make sense of it on their own, but then you always want to follow up with some kind of class discussion, share what everybody's found, and then kind of come to consensus so that kids aren't missing key points. But you want to let them try to figure it out on their own. So if you haven't done 7.1 or 8.1, you may not know exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about this metacognitive stuff. In 7.1, we start out right away with, in the first lesson, introducing the unit challenge. And so the kids do a few activities where they annotate a cartoon, and they see some videos, and they're talking about how do you generate electricity if you're off the grid. And then we ask them to actually read the unit challenge scenario, but they're going to do it with a metacognitive strategy. And so I'm going to ask you guys to try this, and just so you can see how it feels, and won't take that long to do it. But on slide 23, there's a link to, it's actually a shortened version of the unit challenge. And so if you click on the link, you'll make a copy, a Google Doc copy. And then when you're done reading the text, so it's going to ask you to make your own copy so you can do whatever you want with it, write on it, etc. So we've got the text on the first page. And then on the second page, we've got a table here and a metacognitive bookmark. And so I'm going to ask you to just pick out a couple words, sentences, or summaries from the text, and then make some kind of metacognitive connection to that text. Why did you pick it out? Do you have a question about it? Do you want to make a prediction about it? Can you connect it to something you know? And so I'm going to give you a couple minutes to just kind of try that out on your own so you can see how that feels. All right. Let's come back together. I know you probably didn't fill up your whole page yet, but that's fine. I just wanted you to kind of get a sense of what this looks like and what it might feel like, because this is something you can use with any text. You can just pull that template, right off of this document and use it with your kids. Of course, you'd probably want to model a little bit first, but it's super usable. So anybody want to volunteer something you pulled out of that text and which, kind of metacognitive sentence stem or process did you use? Was it a prediction or a connection, etc.?
I picked the sentence, in order to help the team in the gaming tournament, Jamie first needs to figure out how the special rowing machine works. Because throughout that whole part, I was trying to visualize, okay, what would this look like? And thinking as a middle school student, they might not even know what a rowing machine is. So my comments, kind of in my student voice, where I'm trying to figure out how this machine would work. I'm not even sure I know what a rowing machine is. I need to look at one online so that I have a better understanding of it.
Okay. Thanks, Jen. The part that I skipped because we were going through this is the super abbreviated version, is that the anchor in this lesson is a video of a family that uses a rowing machine in their basement to keep their TV running. So they would know that, but still, the fact that you pick that out and you're like, hey, I don't know what this is, and I might need to look up a little more information, is a key kind of metacognitive strategy. You're aware of the things that you have questions about and what you might want to do about that. Anyone else?
I saw that the rowing machine needs to work through any type of weather.
Mm-hmm.
So at first, while reading this, I figured he would have it inside to power the video game system, but this kind of makes me infer that where the rowing machine is going to be outside.
Okay. So you have a question about that, if it's going to be inside, what does the weather matter? And there must be
Right.
something about the location of the rowing machine that makes it. Yeah. So I did shorten it. This scenario is actually longer. I shortened the text just to make it a faster read for this activity. And when we write those scenarios, we're trying to get kids to ask questions for the driving question board, the unit bubble map, that are related to the lesson questions. And one of the things we want them to avoid is getting focused on solar power or excuse me, wind turbines and things like that. So we want to kind of help them kind of focus on the questions that we're going to want them to ask that are going to be related to the lesson. But okay, thanks very much, guys. So you can kind of see how if your kids did this regularly and they used those prompts on the bookmark to kind of, get them started regularly, that would help them to become more competent readers, because good readers are doing that in their heads all the time. And you're just not even really thinking about it, but you're constantly going, what do I know about this? How is this connected to something that I already know? What do I need to know more about? So we did this in teams, in the session, which is always good. We're skipping that team part right now to make this super short, but you would have kids do this, and then they can not only talk about the information that they pulled out, but which strategies did they use, and how was that helpful. And so every time you have that kind of metacognitive conversation about the metacognitive strategies, you're making kids more and more aware of the ways that good readers process visual information. So what I started thinking about was this is less about what we think of as maybe traditional reading strategies like fluency and phonemic awareness and stuff, and more about using text as sense making. And Heather Howlett had always talked about, we're going to use text as inquiry. And I'm like, I don't really know. It's, it's up at the top of the pyramid. It's like 10%. Like, how could it really be inquiry? But thinking about these metacognitive strategies and how they're really kind of helping kids make sense of text, how is that similar to other scientific sense making that we do? When we do CERs, we're having kids use a writing process to make sense of something. When we do sense making in the 5E lessons that we do, the lessons that we do that are phenomenon based and have an uncover share, or in our assessments, kids are doing sense making. And how are those metacognitive reading prompts? Are they similar to some of those processes? And so I have a table here that has the steps in scientific sense making, the steps that you would use to write a CER, and then some of the metacognitive reading prompts from that bookmark. And I'm going to have you use another metacognitive tool. This is from Project Zero. It's a visible thinking routine called 4Cs, and it asks students to use text to make connections, to challenge things that are in the text that maybe they want to argue with, to pick out some key concepts, and to think about what changes would be prompted by this text. And so I am going to put you actually in teams today, or now, and have you look at slide 26, that table, as a form of text. And then as a group, have some chats about connections, challenges, concepts, and changes, and then have one or two people in your group just kind of jot some things in the table. So I see both groups made some connections that, this is the sense-making process, happens in real life, in real science, and in other areas. And for concepts, I see both groups picked up that, the scaffolding and the prompts are really useful, and that sometimes the prompts are kind of working like the scientific method, right? Which is my kind of big aha. I'm like, why does this feel better than other kind of reading instruction to me? And it's like, oh, well, because what we're asking kids to do is what we ask them to do in science. So for challenges, yeah, sometimes students have preconceived notions that are difficult to correct. And that was always my biggest fear when we started doing phenomena-based instruction. And you just didn't tell kids the right answer for a long time. And you try to help them figure it out themselves. That was pretty scary. And that could certainly happen in reading as well. And the idea that this is a linear process, yeah, it's not. People's brains are going all over the place in sense making. We tend to like to list things in steps, but it doesn't necessarily go that way. And I would hope that if you use the metacognitive bookmark kind of prompts often enough, and your kids had those conversations in small groups and whole groups, that would become evident that people approach things maybe in different ways, in different orders, but they can come up with the same thing. And so every text has the potential to change our thinking. Cool. And science sense making, CERs, and metacognitive are related. Yeah, and so we can use them together. So that really helped me feel better about the whole idea of teaching reading and science. Like really what I'm helping kids to do is sense making. It's the same kind of stuff, right? Except they're going to use a text instead of a lab activity. So that we do have the differentiated readings guides in our middle lessons, and you probably don't need to create your own if you're a MyStar subscriber, but just in case you do at some point, you need a sub-plan and you don't have anything available or whatever, there's a whole list of places you can find articles and some of those strategies there. So you can always just ask me, though, the MyStar people, the MyStar subscribers. So all right. And I also did a presentation on CERs, and basically I presented our off-the-shelf claim evidence reasoning lesson. And so we're going to do real quick a little activity. If you can grab a star on slide 32 and put it in the section that your kids struggle the most with. And I guess if it's all of it, I forgot to put a box for all of it, but you can put it over by the all of it here if it's all of it. Otherwise, grab a star and put it in which box on that scaffold your kids struggle the most with. Okay, so I've done this a number of times at NSTA and MSTA, and reasoning is always the big one that people struggle the most with in kids, and mine too, is exactly my experience. If your kids are struggling with evidence, you should know that Tony's working with some MyStar teachers right now on an off-the-shelf lesson that's going to teach kids how to evaluate evidence. So that's coming. This current off-the-shelf CER mostly focuses on reasoning. I always start out with the NGSS Appendix F definition of an explanation, trying to figure out what they were looking for. And their definition is an explanation includes a claim that relates how a variable or variables relate to another variable or a set of variables. Like, okay, here's why we're all confused, right? they didn't even know how to explain it. And so we dug into, Steph and I did a little kind of book study to figure out where CERs came from. And it turns out, we believe, they originated with Kate McNeil and Joe Kraychuk in this book that was published in 2012. So pre-NGSS, on supporting middle school students in constructing explanations in science. And they came up with this CER framework that we're all super familiar with. So, but kids really struggle with the reasoning, and, you know, so they can list the evidence, and then you're like, okay, so connect your evidence to the claim. And they're like, well, if you just look at the evidence, you know that the claim's right or wrong, right? Like, what more do you want me to do, right? And a lot of times I was kind of like, I don't know, because it's just kind of obvious, right? Tony and one of our other colleagues before COVID had done a presentation at NSTA where they kind of proposed, what if we included the science principle in this process? What difference would that make? And so when Steph and I were digging into the CER stuff a couple years ago, I'm like, let's drag that back in here and let's see if that would make a difference. And so what we proposed is that we add a box to our CERs where we identify the science principles. And I double checked this. Paul Anderson from Bozeman Science kind of had a very similar idea. I'm like, okay, we're on the right track. So, and then we'll kind of set up that reasoning box so they kind of do a we know, we saw, therefore kind of a thing, where we know that, and they would talk about the science principle. And the principle is something that we all, not what we're discovering today, but things about science that we all know to be true, that we already know to be true. So not what we're explaining today, but what do we already know about this topic? And then we saw that, so do a summary of the evidence, and therefore tie the principle and the evidence to answer the claim. And that little formula seems to really work a whole lot better. And so you're going to add some ways you can scaffold that, add a box for the principle, do the sentence starters in the reasoning box, so they have those 3 prompts. You can add a little prompt or a description for each section so they remember what the purpose of it is. You could fill in parts of it. If you're not worried about claimant right now, just don't make them write it, fill it in. Same with the science principle. Sometimes identifying the science principle is hard. So, you know, just give them the science principle so that they know we're all in agreement, this is what it is. So there's some things you can do to scaffold that. And then thinking about argumentation, because we tend to kind of use them interchangeably. And I know the scientists and engineers that we work with are kind of like, you know, they never really thought about the difference. The people who wrote NGSS said they're 2 different things, but, you know, they kind of get used at the same time. So the argumentation definition is a little clearer. It says it goes beyond explanations, and it involves listening to, comparing, and evaluating competing ideas and methods. So we've already got our explanation. Now we have maybe somebody else who has a different explanation or a solution to a problem. And so how can we decide which one is most accurate? So one of the key pieces that we realized is that if you're going to have kids do an argument, you have to plan it ahead of time so that there's going to be some uncertainty. So we have some instances where the PE has argumentation as the key SEP for the performance expectation, but there's not really a lot of uncertainty involved. And so sometimes it's kind of awkward. So what we're working on right now is kind of going through our own curriculum and looking for places where maybe we forced argumentation, but maybe an explanation is adequate, or a place where we just ask kids to do an explanation, but maybe argumentation is adequate. And we are working on it's going to be an optional and also differentiated set of CER formats that you can use in our units in place of what's already there, if you want to be consistent with this. So, it is clear from the research that arguments happen after you've come to this explanation. So we suggest just have the kids do the CER, and then the argument gets added at the bottom. And again, it's in places where there is discourse around competing claims. And there are some sentence starters that you can use in the argumentation box. I included this poster that one of our teachers uses. She asks her kids to describe an argument, and then they do this lesson, and then she asks them to describe an academic argument, and then she leaves that poster up so they can see the difference. And there's a real quick recap of the phases in that lesson that's available on the off-the-shelf page. All right, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to turn this over to Lindsay.
All right, thank you, Chris. So at NSTA, I did a presentation with Tony about using the decision matrix. And so we were able to introduce some teachers that maybe had struggled in their past experiences with how to help students make some of these decisions. And so we really felt like some teachers walked away with some new tools that they could use from NSTA. So that was exciting for me to experience. And so for my STAR teachers, we have the off-the-shelf lesson using a decision matrix to compare solutions. We also have an open education resource version of that lesson that is available. So if you have friends and colleagues that maybe aren't my STAR subscribers, this is free, available for anyone on our public educators website. And so this is the lesson that I presented on at NSTA, and we kind of presented it as like real life engineering tools. How can you help your students select the best solution for your problem-based or place-based unit? And as you know, in my STAR units, we have certain places where we do incorporate this. There's certain units that it really lends itself to. But maybe there's other contexts or examples that you are aware of that we'd love to hear. And also, what are your experiences in the classroom? So what benefits have you seen from using problem or place-based learning in your classroom? And then, what types of examples have you used? Maybe it's from a MyStar unit, maybe it's something else. But these are great, right? The benefits, they get to be creative, they make connections with real life. They can feel like maybe they're being a real scientist. They can connect natural phenomena in everyday things that they see in their life. And the hands-on work, of course, with that problem and place-based is so exciting for them. And a few things that were shared at the session were life is projects or problems. Like this reflects skills that we all can need to develop as we become lifelong learners, right? And using those mixed materials or learning modalities in real life contexts really can help engage maybe some students that might not be quite as engaged on the paper pencil type of activities or canned phenomena. And so some problems that folks are using, like a parachute design for their bottle rockets and how to, mitigate natural hazards and, different types of, like, there's lots of problems. What are some others in MyStar with, like the cups that they use in 7.4, which cup is the best for the cafeteria? There's lots of engineering application to those types of contexts. One that was shared in the session was, trying to mitigate school bus emissions and parent pickup, like idling in the parking lots. Like, how could students develop a solution to that problem? Because that seems to be a problem everywhere, for most schools at least. So these are some great examples. Thanks so much for sharing. And, these engineering PEs are really embedded in NGSS. They get their own special pillar, just like life science, earth and space science, physical science. We get this engineering design piece. And really, they're talking about this systematic process to, look at solutions, evaluate them, use criteria and constraints. But what is this systematic process and how can you work with that with your students? Well, we, developed the decision matrix. Or not, we didn't develop it, but we have incorporated the decision matrix as the systematic process that MyStar recommends you use with your students. And so just like really brief vocab to make sure we're all on the, same page. We've got criteria and constraints, one of which is attributes that are desirable for a successful solution. They can be ranked good, better, best. And the other one is attributes that are required for a successful solution. So those are like yes, no's. Give you just a moment to think, and then we'll move on here. So one criteria is one, constraints the other. And the key here is that in the decision matrix, we're really going to be working with criteria, which are attributes that are desirable for a successful solution. They can be ranked. So you can check your progress there. Were you correct? Presumably, we've already evaluated for constraints. Does it meet our solution? Yes, no. If it doesn't, it gets tossed out. It doesn't get put in the decision matrix. If you find that your students aren't quite up to snuff with these types of science words, we do offer like a prior lesson that you can work with your students on. It really helps define those criteria and constraints and how to conduct that discussion with your students, how to define good criteria and constraints, which can be very helpful then leading into this decision matrix lesson. This is also open education resource on our resources for educators page. So again, colleagues or friends that are outside of MyStar are welcome to use this as well. And so the decision matrix lesson has two uncover shares, but we do want to give those multiple contexts for students. We do start off with a less threatening context to kind of introduce this idea of a decision matrix without overwhelming their brains with the layering the science on top of it. And so beans into a cup is the start of the anchor, and then they go into this snacks context, which we think is not very threatening and hopefully is kind of engaging. They can get into a discussion, right? And so and then they've got a couple other contexts like purple loosestrife, an invasive buckthorn, and I'll talk a little bit about the connect in our context. It's offered as the big-headed carp context, but if you've got a different project that you're working on, that would be a great place to slip in your project or problem-based decision matrix as part of the scaffold for this lesson. And so the snacks, again, we're trying to make a non-threatening context to start off. In your classroom, you might present 3 different snacks pre-chosen, perhaps. You might have already eliminated. Someone has a peanut allergy, Snickers are off the table. And so you might be able to front load, the options for snacks. You could also leave it up to the class and, have them choose 3. That's up to your call in your classroom, what you feel comfortable working with your students. And then they're going to use, some of the information, their opinions about the snacks to come to consensus on one best snack for the whole class. Well, that's kind of you're probably going to get some varying, preferences, student to student, even small group to small group. And so it provides some good discussion. Like I said, you might want to preload the snack options. In the session, we provided the criteria that the participants ranked the snacks on. So our criteria were sweet, quick to eat, and crunchy. You might want to take the time with your students in the class to develop those criteria. It's up to you again, how much time you have and how much practice you'd like to give your students on developing good criteria, or if you just need to get to that decision, you might want to preload those for them. And then during the lesson, they kind of march out the steps of a decision matrix, which are fairly straightforward. You pick your criteria and you put those in your table. You choose an importance value. We recommend that it's out of 100, but there's some math involved. So we do kind of suggest that you tell your students, make those numbers end in 0. You could do, 1 out of 10. There's some ways you can simplify depending on, the math skills of your students. The next step, number 3, would be assign the ratings for each of the criteria. You calculate scores and then you add up those scores. I'm giving you a really quick flyby right now. The decision matrix lesson plan is a little more detailed to help you walk through that with your students. But this would be an example decision matrix for different snacks, which snack won. You can see that one of those gray columns is the importance value, 50, 20, 30, nice round numbers, because there is a little math involved with multiplication and addition. But this gives you a somewhat non-biased way to pick the snack that maybe allows everyone to have at least their opinion heard on what they think they wanted and how, the rating for Chewy, was it a 2 or a 3 on the different characteristics. And so in the off-the-shelf lesson, the Connect is provided as the context from the Unit 6.6 unit challenge, which is the decline of sport fish in the Illinois River. So where they apply this decision matrix is towards the end of the unit, where they've learned a lot of science around what's affecting these big-headed carp, or the sport fish. And there are big-headed carp that are kind of interplaying in these the population dynamics. And so they look at different methods to be used to like remedy that decline in the sport fish. And a lot of it has to do around mitigating the big-headed carp. But that's where they apply that. Here is where you might want to bring in, if you're doing, a different project that you want to bring in that decision matrix. This would be a great opportunity to make it place-based for your classroom. So I kind of threw a bit at you, but wondering if there were any, thoughts that you had about other places that a decision matrix might be useful. I know one example that I've heard is, if you're trying to buy or rent a house and you've got some competing places, which one's the best? This one's kind of closer to work, but this one's got the really nice garden. Gosh, I don't know which one. That would be one other example. If anyone had any other thoughts, there's sticky notes on slide 59 that, it could be in class, it could be in real life. If you would share, if you have any thoughts on where a decision matrix could be useful. Yeah, these are great examples. Buying a car, choosing a career. Boy, that's leaving it up to the decision matrix fate there. I love it. Yeah, which grocery store to go to on sale days. And Chris, I see this one about students deciding what sport to participate in. Did you want to share your classroom experience with that?
Sorry, had to find my mute button. Yeah, so that happened in my classroom. I introduced my sixth graders to decision matrices. We were doing Unit 6.6, and the next day, one of my students came in and she said, "Mrs. Gary made a decision matrix last night," and I was like, "You did?" She said, "Yeah, my mom told me I want to play basketball and take dance lessons, and my mom told me I can only do one, and I really couldn't decide." And so she used the exact same process that we had done and set up her own rating scale and everything and came to a decision. She chose basketball. But yeah, so it is a real life thing that that even sixth graders can use the next day. All right, welcome back. It is about time to go. I know I offered the people in my room. I know there are a few people who maybe had questions still. I'm happy to hang out later. And I'm sure Tony and Lindsay will too, if there's a conversation that we want to continue. But if you're done for the night, we really appreciate you being here. Please join us again sometime in the near future. There's a list of things that are coming up. We will be on MSTA also in March. And there's a grant. I think you can get some money towards your conference fees there. Join us on our Facebook page. And we also have some feedback opportunities if you're interested on that last slide. So again, thanks so much for being here. And if there is something that you want to continue to talk to us about, we're happy to hang out for a little bit and answer all your questions. Otherwise, enjoy your night and thanks for being here.